Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode in our Critical Creativity and Action webinar series. We're so excited that you are here with us today. My name is Jackie Gardy, and I'll be your host. We also have Chris and Kara and Kate behind the scenes who will be answering your questions and responding to your comments. This series will highlight the exciting new resource called Critical Creativity and Action. Our presenter, Dan Ryder, and I created this resource with support from many teachers around the world. Critical Creativity in Action is a card deck and manual containing literacy strategies designed to help EFL teachers add opportunities for creative and critical thinking in their classrooms. We are sharing the link to this free resource in the chat, and we will continue to share it during our webinar today. Please share this resource with your colleagues near and far. Throughout these 6 webinars, we'll learn how to incorporate these free materials into our classrooms to engage our students' creative minds. Each session will focus on a different aspect of the Critical Creativity and Action resources, so we encourage you to attend as many of these sessions as possible. So what can you expect when you join us for these special webinars? Each webinar will be about 60 minutes long. We will focus on one or a few of the activities available in the newest resource for teachers on americanenglish.state.gov, which is called Critical Creativity in Action. We will explore the materials and activities from this resource, and we'll share ways to use this resource in the classroom. And we'll finish each episode with thoughts and ideas for adapting materials from this resource. Please use the comments in the chat to share your questions and ideas as we move along today. We really want to hear from you. Now, the guiding question for this webinar series is, how might we use creativity to help our learners become critical thinkers? Each episode will help us to answer that question in a different way. So in today's episode, Quick Activities for Big Thinking, we will examine how critical creativity and action cards help us practice all the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. We'll practice our critical creativity skills using the Critical Creativity and Action card deck. And we'll explore ways to expand learning experiences using the questions found on the Critical Creativity and Action cards. So let's begin with this prompt to engage our creativity and get us started today. What feelings do we experience as we solve challenging problems? Type your answers in the chat while I introduce our guest speaker. We are so pleased to have Dan Ryder presenting this series with us. Dan is a design facilitator at the Community Regional Charter School in Skowhegan, Maine, and he teaches science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and English and design classes in grades 7 to 12. He has 25 years of classroom teaching experience, and he works as a consultant for the Office of English Language Programs. He's the writer of Panels and Perspectives, Creating Comics in the EFL Classroom. He's the co-creator of the Critical Creativity and Action card deck, and he's the co-author of the book, Intention, Critical Creativity in the Classroom. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's an honor to have you.
It is an honor to be here, Jackie. I'm really excited for us to get started. And just to quickly review what Jackie mentioned just a few moments ago, this session, we're going to examine how critical creativity and action cards help us practice all levels of Bloom's taxonomy. We're going to practice our critical creativity skills using the Critical Creativity and Action card deck. And then we're going to explore ways to extend learning experiences using the questions on the Critical Creativity and Action cards.
And also during our time together today, keep an eye out on the slides with the campfire icon. This campfire icon is a signal we'll be using responding to a prompt in the chat. Campfires are used in cultures all over the world for people to share stories, information, insights, and ideas. People gather around campfires to ask questions, create solutions, and make plans. So we're going to use the campfire icon as our signal today for responding to all of these prompts.
So let's take a look at some of the responses from our very first campfire question, which was, what feelings do we experience as we solve challenging problems? Jackie, what are you seeing there in the chat?
Well, it looks like we only have a couple so far, but Patricia says sometimes we may feel anxious.
Yes, I definitely can relate to that. I feel anxious all the time when I'm trying to do something that I think is going to be really hard, because I'm constantly worried about, one, being able to solve it, but two, I'm worried about the people who are going to be affected by the solution and what they're going to think.
Exactly. We have some curiosity,
Oh, I like that.
excitement,
I like that idea of
and
curiosity a lot. That's a different one. I don't think we heard that one in our other webinar today.
I don't think we did either. And we also have some worries. Okay, so there's concerns.
Yep, definitely.
And Diana is just excited. She said, "This is awesome. Critical thinking is instrumental to enhance engagement in our learners."
Well, and that's a really great point about the importance of excitement and thrill, right? Like it can be really hard and difficult to solve challenging problems and to do deeper thinking, but it can also be really wonderful, and it can fill you full of energy and enthusiasm. Jackie, we didn't hear from you. What are some of the feelings you experience when you solve challenging problems?
Well, I'm always a little bit nervous at the start. I'm the kind of person that likes to have all my ducks in a row, if that makes sense, before I take on a challenge. So that means like having everything in order, so that I can solve the problem. And I like to know all of the problems for a particular challenge before I set out to solve anything. So I think
See, I
that can
think
be
that's
good
why
and
you and I
bad.
work well together, because I rarely have all of my ducks in a row, and I like not knowing exactly what's going to happen next, because that's when I do my best thinking. But I get anxious because I know you like to have things in it well laid out. And so it's that solving challenging problems is often collaborative. And that's what it's like in a classroom, right? We have students, we have educators, we have expectations from families, we have expectations from administrators. Like there's a lot of people that we have to think about when we're solving tough problems when it comes to learning.
Absolutely. Looks like we've had some really great responses. Diana says, again, we can tap into the thrilling side of challenging problems, especially when we are prepared and we have built confidence in our students.
Absolutely. That confidence is so important. And that's a great transition into the next part of our webinar here, because it's difficult to build confidence if you don't know much about the topic. So let's build some prior knowledge here and dig in.
Sounds good. Can you tell us what you mean by critical creativity?
Yeah, I absolutely can. So critical creativity is what happens when we combine creative expression with critical thinking to develop deeper understanding and mastery of skills, concepts, and knowledge. And there are some examples here from my classroom. Now, these are my actual students' work. And what we'll do in my learning spaces involves building circuits to explain cultural values. We'll design games to demonstrate our conversational skills, and we'll draw illustrations to practice our vocabulary skills. So another way you can think about critical creativity in terms of trying to wrap your head around what this really means, it allows students to build authentic literacy skills while exercising their imaginations and their creative spirits. And this picture here is a really great example of that, where a learner had to create a creature that would survive and thrive in our local climate, and they need to use their vocabulary and accurately diagram and design that creature.
It's a beautiful drawing, and I really like how your student labeled all of those things on that drawing. So before we look at the critical creativity cards and the thinking that they inspire, let's think about the experience of creating higher order thinking experiences. So now we have campfire question number 2. What are some of the challenges we face when asking our learners to engage in complex critical thinking activities? Now, put your responses in the chat. And while we do that, Dan, what are some of the challenges you face when asking learners to engage in complex critical thinking? It looks like you have some ideas there on the slide already.
I do, and I drew some little cartoons to help prompt that thinking. So one of the challenges we face is that complex critical thinking activities can be really hard, and it's hard to know how to scaffold them. And scaffolding is putting things into smaller steps that take us to that new knowledge. And there in that little cartoon are 2 characters that I call Box and Button that we've used before in some of our American English experiences that you and I have designed, Jackie. I brought those characters back because I think they need to be used. But they're talking about Button up on top is saying, like, you can do it, Box, right? You just have to use the scaffolds, right? So that's one of the challenges. Another is time. And there on the right, we see Box and Button stressed out about clocks and watches and calendars and notes and books, and just how much time it takes to plan for critical creativity and complex critical thinking. And most of it is the worry about the time. And that takes us to the anxiety one there in the bottom left, where they're trembling with worry and fear because they're not sure if they're going to be able to do this. And then finally on the right is not knowing what the purpose is. Why are we doing these activities? And why are we asking our learners to think in this way? And it really helps to have a goal, and it relieves some of those anxieties. So what are some of our participants saying are the challenges that they bump into?
Let's see. It looks like one of the challenges Diana says is to have a clear goal students can resonate with. So I guess developing clear goals.
Yep, can be really challenging, especially if you have competing goals, where you have a goal in mind for your students have a goal in mind for themselves, and then maybe another group of people has a goal in mind that they want all of your students and you to reach.
Yep. And I'm also seeing several comments about time and scaffolding, like I guess having the time to scaffold and then having the time to teach during the lesson.
Right.
And then we have some great insights too. So Zafar says critical thinking is thinking rationally and reasonably. What do you think about that, Dan?
Oh, I love that. Rationally and reasonably, using the evidence available to us, right? Like not just putting things together because it's what we're feeling, but rather it's what we know, and that we're able to make sense of things. And that can take time, right? And it's difficult to find that time when we're feeling a lot of pressure from different directions. So what we're hoping that today's webinar is going to provide some very quick activities that allow you to get to that place where you can do that reasonable thinking and that rational thinking while still doing a lot of very fun and engaging activities.
Absolutely. And do we have just a couple more thoughts before we move on here? So
absolutely. I love hearing all the thoughts. This is why I love doing these webinars.
Me too. So Patricia says, if we don't give clear instructions and clarify what the goal is, they might be confused at first. That's a good point.
Excellent point. Giving clear instructions is definitely a challenge. And knowing which instructions are going to help your learners accomplish the task is also a challenge. Because I've written many instructions and then realized I didn't write the best instructions.
Exactly. And CD says, through critical creativity and action, students have more time to express imagination. I like that.
Oh, I love that. And imagination is so important. People forget that imagination is critical thinking, because you are coming up with things all on your own, all inside of your own head, based on all of your experiences and all the things you've seen around you and all the information that's in there. But we tend to think of imagination as just having fun, but it's so much more than that.
Definitely. So it looks like there's many challenges, but I'm hoping that today's session will help you all feel more confident and comfortable using critical creativity in action. So let's go to that now and see what Dan has to provide in terms of examples of what we mean by critical creativity in action.
Excellent. So the first thing we want to do is look at these cards and see how they help us practice all the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So you can see that there's higher order thinking happening with these activities. And we're going to dig into those in just a moment after we review Bloom's taxonomy. So for people who don't know, Bloom's taxonomy is a system used to organize the complexity of thinking and learning tasks. So if you look here on this diagram, you can see that create and evaluate are higher order tasks, while comprehension and understanding are on the lower order tasks. They're all important. All thinking is important in Bloom's taxonomy. However, the higher order tasks are the ones that represent that critical thinking and problem solving, that rational thinking and reasonable thinking that we talked about just a moment ago in the discussion. This new critical creativity in action card deck, it contains 49 ideas for integrating critical creativity into any classroom. The more complex thinking activities are color-coded to the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, while the less complex thinking activities are color-coded to the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Now we're going to take a look at some of those specific activities, such as Score the News. Score the News relies on learners having an understanding of the facts, details, and information from a text in order to create a short piece of music that might accompany the text as we read it. So while the act of music composition is certainly higher order thinking, it's definitely creation, Score the News depends on learners' factual knowledge. Otherwise, the tone and rhythms of music might be completely inappropriate. Another activity is Wonder Walk, and this one helps us with application and analysis. It's an activity that calls on learners to identify evidence of their prior knowledge in the world around them and capture that evidence in drawings and doodles. They have to apply their vocabulary knowledge and their cultural knowledge and their other understandings in order to make accurate representations of their surroundings and their community. And finally, Mundane Marvels is an activity that asks learners to create spontaneous pieces of art from the objects in their immediate surroundings. Learners would arrange and rearrange those objects to represent an important concept or an understanding from class. And even though these learners may be using everyday objects, they're creating pieces of art and they're engaging in the higher order parts of their brains to do that.
Amazing. These cards all look so exciting. And thank you for that quick look at how critical creativity cards are aligned to the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Today's webinar is focused on using quick activities in the classroom as a gateway to deeper thinking and higher levels on Bloom's taxonomy. So with that in mind, this brings us to campfire question number 3. We want to hear from you. What are some advantages and disadvantages of using quick learning activities in the classroom? Type your thoughts in the chat. And Dan, maybe you could discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of using quick-paced activities in your classroom, and maybe tell us what you think quick means as well.
So I define quick as 5 to 10 minutes. That's what I think of as a quick activity. My classes are typically about an hour long. Sometimes they're a little longer, sometimes a little shorter, but almost always right around an hour. And so I think of a quick activity as something that I can do in 5 or 10 minutes and help my learners just to get thinking quickly. I want them to start doing creating and making and producing little artifacts of their thinking as fast as they can, because that lets me know immediately what they're thinking, right? So that's one of the big advantages is I can get a real sense of what my learners are thinking and experiencing, where their knowledge is at, by doing a quick activity. And rather than using something like a quiz, which some people do, or just asking some oral questions, which other people do, I find that using these quick creative exercises provide visuals and sounds and other sorts of materials that allow me to have a deeper, richer conversation with learners about what they know. So those are some of the advantages. And the disadvantages, sometimes a quick activity can turn into a really long activity if you're not really cognizant, very thoughtful about the time. And sometimes we feel like we don't have time to work in those quick activities because we can feel the pressures from a curriculum or pressures from our own schedule. That's also why we're really focusing on the quick ones today, so that people can find places where they can just slide them in. Jackie, what are some
Exactly.
of our participants saying about their advantages and disadvantages for quick learning activities?
Well, let's see. We see one of the advantages is actually time, because they're simple. These strategies are simple to apply, and they can help with students' short attention span, so we can add variety to our lessons.
Absolutely. That's a great point about attention span.
Sean Mira, sorry if I'm not saying that right, makes the class interesting and energetic.
Yes, it's a great, sometimes in one of my other worlds of work I do is improv, and they call these stokes, these quick activities, because they builds up the energy just like a fire. And that's a really good point.
And Diana says, I don't really see a disadvantage.
Well, I typically don't see a lot of disadvantages either. Really, for me, it's the one I mentioned, which is sometimes I enjoy these quick activities so much that I will let them turn into the whole class. And then I'll realize, oh no, we didn't get to all the rest of the lesson because we were having such a good time doing these activities.
Absolutely. Zafar says it's a great idea to save time and make the students more active, but one disadvantage can be that the phantom and alienated learners might not get enough time to learn.
That is very, very true. And that's why it's important that we work into these activities really good learning strategies for introverts and extroverts. And we provide wait time and a lot of different ways for people to go about sharing what they created. So it doesn't all have to be a conversation in front of everyone. You can really use any of these activities for the learners who most need some extra time to process. They can still participate and still be part of things.
Absolutely. And Jackie, hi Jackie. She says they reactivate their attention.
Oh, I love that. That's a great visual too, that idea of reactivating. Because most learners really want to learn. But sometimes they can come into our classrooms kind of looking a little tired, a little less than engaged, right? And just reminding them of how exciting learning can be.
Yes. And I remember, like, one of the biggest challenges I had in my classroom, I had a fairly large classroom with mixed ages, was there's so much chaos at the very beginning of class.
Yes.
And I found that having these like short activities ready to go and would really help the students just get a little bit more focused before we went on to the content of the lessons. And I didn't really feel like I was wasting time because I would have been trying to calm them down anyways.
And it's also a good activity at the very end for similar reasons. So you can use these in the last 10 minutes or so as an exit strategy or an exit ticket to kind of say, all right, now you're going to carry this thinking with you. Let's use all the things that we learned today during our lesson in this final experience. And it leaves on a really high note, an energetic note, and it focuses them, because that's when learners tend to remember the most, is when they've been engaged, not just in getting the facts and the figures right and getting their technical skills correct. It's when they're feeling excited about using those and can see some opportunities with them.
Well, speaking of time as a challenge, I think we need to get going and move on
Sure.
and focus on the next goal of this webinar, which is to explore several of the critical creativity and action cards and follow-up questions for learners included on these cards. And Dan has chosen 3 activities for us all to practice right now. So we'll be able to look at these and play with these right now in the next hour.
That's right. And all of these are there in the deck. So let's try this one together as a group. This one's called binary voting. And what it asks learners to do is to think of a question that only has 2 possible responses, and then create a voting station where their classmates or their educators and even members of the community might be able to respond to that question. Typically, we really want to encourage people to use physical polling stations with jars and bowls, stones or shells or beads or any other small objects to cast their votes. Now, here we're on a webinar, so we're confined to a digital space, and that's okay. So we're going to do the best we can to have the same experience here for you. We can still ask very powerful questions, and we can still propose very powerful statements and analyze the data that we get from our responses. So let's go to our first question. Respond in the chat with agree or disagree to the statement below. Learners should learn how to speak in English before learning how to write in English. Agree or disagree?
Wow, that's a bold statement. What if people are unsure? What if they don't want to answer yes or no, or agree or disagree?
That's a great question. Speaking of questions, that's a really good question. It's really valuable for learners to have to take a stance, even when they don't feel comfortable doing so. So you kind of let your instincts go where they are. Like whatever first comes to mind, oh, I probably feel this way. Well, the critical thinking comes in when you go, oh, I'm not sure if I still feel that way. That's all right. So it's okay if you feel down the middle. You still should pick the one that feels the strongest to you, even though you may see reasons for the other side as well.
It looks like we have a lot of agrees so far, but a few different disagrees.
But mostly
Two.
agrees.
Yeah.
That's interesting because this morning in the other session of this same webinar, people were very split down the middle. So I think that's great. It actually aligns with where a lot of language instruction is going, right? Where it's much more about the conversation and being able to communicate orally and less in the written word, right? But I know that
Yes.
when I first learned how to speak Spanish, I had to learn how to write Spanish before I ever learned how to say it, at least in school. I had learned a lot from Sesame Street and other educational programs. Let's go to another question here. All right, respond in the chat with past or present to the question below. When teaching about American culture, should we focus on the events and people of the past or the events and people of the present? And if you're not sure how you should respond to American culture or teach American culture, you could just put in your local culture. When teaching about culture, should we focus on the events and people of the past or the events and people of the present? What do you think, Jackie?
Can I vote nothing? I don't know.
No, you have to make a decision.
Just like everyone else. Okay.
Just like everyone else, we have to have a binary vote.
I think that it's important to have a foundation of the past before we teach about the present. And I think that we can learn a lot from the past to understand what's happening in the present, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And that's why I like to teach about the present first, and then explain how we got to the past, how we got there from the past. So we are on different sides of this question. What are our participants thinking?
This also, well, this definitely is a 50-50. We've got some saying past, some saying present, some saying that you can't do one without the other.
That's very true. I would say that very same thing. My experience with a lot of culture and history classes is that we focus only on the past and rarely get to the present, which is why when I teach history, I focus on what is happening right now and what's the historical reasons for that. What happened before that led us to now? Because so often when I was in school, which was admittedly quite a while ago, I only ever learned about the past. I rarely knew about what was happening in the world around me.
So Diana agrees with you. She said she likes that. Look around you and what our culture reflects, and then see how we got here because of what happened before.
See, Diana, that's great thinking. I totally agree with you. Let's do one more of these. Respond in the chat with either artist or scientist to the following question. And this one is a, as I like to say, a doozy. Would you rather be an artist who uses science to create art, or a scientist who uses art to explain science? Now, Jackie, I already know what your response would be, but I think you need to let everyone in the participating today know.
Yeah, I think I would have to say artist who uses art to explain science.
Yeah, well, you just mixed them together. I just noticed that. You just said you're an artist who uses art to explain science, right? I am more of an artist who uses my knowledge of science to put together art as well. What about our participants? I think it's going to be 50-50.
It doesn't seem to be. It seems that we're leaning more toward artist.
Wow, excellent. Well, I shouldn't say excellent because it's okay either way. I just find it exciting when there's a trend, when we tend to go one way or the other.
Yep. They're still coming in. Scientist, it's almost every other one. Scientist, artist, scientist, artist.
So let's look at the next slide. And the next slide, we're going to talk about some of these follow-up questions you can ask to expand on this activity, right? So your learners have created these binary voting stations and they collected some data, right? So one of the questions you could ask them is, what's a question you'd like to ask others? We just asked these questions among our peers or our classmates. So what's another question you'd like to ask? And another thing that you might be able to prompt them with is, what do you predict the responses will be? So before we even take them, let's look at all the questions we're going to ask, and let's make predictions based on evidence, going back to what I heard one of our participants say earlier about what critical thinking is. All right, based on the evidence and based on your observations, what do you think, what do you predict the responses will be? And then my favorite is to take these results and then create something with them. So what might we create that could share these insights with others? Could we create a piece of art? Could we create a story? Could we make a comic or a film or a piece of music based on this evidence? And those can get pretty intense and pretty complicated, right? So instead, let's take a moment to think about which literacy skills our learners could develop using binary voting.
Now I see that you have on this slide analysis, evaluation, and creation color coded. So these are color coded based on our Bloom's taxonomy pyramid. And these are the kinds of questions you can ask to hit each of those Bloom's taxonomies.
Right. Because we want people to understand that just by asking a question, you can start to push your learners to think more deeply and think more critically. So sometimes it can be a question. And just a question alone can get us into that place where we're thinking, even if they don't make the project, like what might we create to share these insights with others? Where does their imagination take them? And let their imagination become in the form of lists or short pieces of writing where they just explain what they would do. It still gets us into that place in their minds where they get to do some deeper thinking.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that you could easily use this to kick off a paragraph description of why you believe something is the way it should be.
Absolutely.
Or why you disagree with one of these binary questions.
I totally agree. We could also turn some of those polling stations into stations where there's a person standing there asking the question. So you might walk up and make a signal to them to let them know you like their question. They ask the question and they place the vote, right? Almost like a human polling place. It could be a way to get some of your learners up and moving around the room too.
I absolutely love all these ideas, but I think we need to move on to our next activity.
Okay, let's do it. So this one's called Imagifor. Imagifor challenges learners to choose photos that metaphorically explain concepts or ideas. So it's all about using visuals and comparisons. So if we take metaphor plus image, we get Imagifor. It's a portmanteau, which is a fancy word for a word made up of other words. So what we're going to do is think about the process of learning new vocabulary. And I want you to look at these 4 images, especially these images, because each of these are pictures of an activity, but look carefully at the picture itself and think which of these best represents the experience of learning new vocabulary for you. So Jackie, as you look at these pictures, which of these best represents the experience of learning new vocabulary for you?
Well, for me, I'd have to say climbing, because that indicates like building your vocabulary, building your knowledge of words in a different language. And vocabulary is one of the tricky things for me to learn in a language. So it definitely feels like I'm climbing a mountain to absorb all the vocabulary that I might need to communicate with others.
Do you feel
What about
alone
you?
on that mountain when you're
Sorry?
learning vocabulary? Do you feel alone like this climber is?
I can. I mean, my experience learning a different language would be with index cards and just constantly going back and forth with the English and then the other language, right? So that's sort of a I would say that's sort of an individual activity.
See, and for me, earlier, I talked about cooking being the one that I would choose for me, but the more I've thought about it today, I think I might go with dancing, especially this picture of dancing, because I think it looks a lot like me when I dance. But what it is when I'm learning new vocabulary, I feel like there's a whole audience like expecting me to know things. So I'm trying not to make a mistake. And sometimes that can put me into really comfortable uncomfortable situations. And I kind of feel like I'm balancing a lot of things at once. And there's all these people expecting me to know all these new words. And I just have to keep going with it until the music stops. Even if I end up doing a split and freezing in the air.
We've got some great responses coming in the chat too. So Adriana says cooking, because first you add new words like ingredients, and then you can create sentences and texts with those words.
Yes, I love that. That's fantastic. That's exactly what Imagifor is asking students to do with their thinking.
And Diana said it could also be painting because a painting is unique and our choice of vocabulary words is unique to how we individually like to express ourselves.
Absolutely. And painting relies on the paints that are on the palette. And you can't paint if you don't have paint, and you can't speak if you don't have vocabulary, if you don't have the words for it. And sometimes you have to make up new words like Imagifor by combining other words, just like paint.
And lastly, we have Zafar saying cooking because you have to decide what ingredients should be added and when, so that the broth might not be spoiled. The same is the case with vocabulary learning.
I love that, like not to spoil it, because you have to know exactly when to put in the right flavors. Because it's not just knowing all the flavors, it's knowing when to apply them. Oh, I think that's fantastic. I love these. These are great. So let's take a look at some of the follow-up questions that you could ask around an Imagifor. So you might ask an analysis question. You might ask, how is your response similar or different from other responses? And so we could analyze what everyone said here in our webinar and start breaking that down. Wow, these people said this and these people said that. What is that telling us? What are we learning? What are we discovering? Right? We could do some evaluation. What does your response reveal about your learning experiences? If you choose an image that's very negative, why are you feeling that way about that experience of learning vocabulary? What happened that led you to that response? Or a very positive image, what led you there? And finally, and this is another one of my favorites, because I love to get into creating, how might we create a gallery of Imagifors that explains the language learning process? So what would happen if learners chose representations, activities that represent their learning as an Imagifor, and they drew their own and put them up in a gallery, or went and took some photos and you were able to share those photos? Some people can share them digitally. Some people might be able to print them off, but you don't have to do that. You can take out some index cards or some slips of paper and do some drawings and create your own gallery right there in any room.
Yeah, definitely. Or you could even like do it with emojis, maybe.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. That would be great. And then you could do an interesting activity with people going through, like when you're having a group discussion, you're working on a new concept, you could quickly say, go choose the emoji, go choose the Imagifor that best fits your thinking right now. That could be really great.
Yeah, and before we move on, we do have one question from the audience
Yes.
from Lasma. She asked, do we have to provide the picture as it's not on the card?
So typically, yes, right? So there won't be pictures on the cards, right? One of the things that you'll need to do is find pictures. We find pictures using unsplash.org is one of our favorite places to find photos, because they're all Creative Commons licensed, so you can use them with fair use. The other great way to get pictures is have your learners create them. Have them draw, give them a few different topics. That could be, I could imagine a class where each day for the first 3 days of classes, you start with a quick drawing and then labeling it with your vocabulary, perhaps. And then on the 4th day, you use those as Imagifors. You collect all those pictures to say, so which of these pictures best represents how you're feeling about the lessons we've done this week?
That sounds really cool. I like that a lot. And I guess another thing we could do is, many of our students, not all of our students, but a lot of our students now do have mobile phones and they're able to take pictures. So we could ask them to look through their own galleries of pictures and pick out pictures for this activity as well.
I've done that with my learners where they each had a tablet or a phone. And I said to find a picture and then leave that. They went around the room and they set that photo down on a desk so that people didn't know whose they were. And then we had to go and figure out whose whose phones belong to whom based on the picture.
Wow, I like that a lot. So Dan, I think we have one more activity to do before this webinar comes to a close.
We do. It's a really challenging one. I hope our participants are up for it.
I think they are.
Okay. This one is called the question storm. And in a question storm, we're going to practice asking a lot of questions. It's a green color activity, so it's color coded to application. So what you're going to do is apply your knowledge of a topic that I'm about to give you to generate thought-provoking questions that challenge your fellow participants. Now, this is based on a classical form of discussion called the Socratic seminar. Socrates was this Greek philosopher and teacher, and he would ask his learners to respond to one another using only questions. This challenged the learners to think even more deeply about the topic. Now, we adapted it a little bit here to better suit an even wider range of learners than just those in front of us. So here's our topic we're going to consider: using art to learn languages. So for the next minute or so, just want you to think. You don't have to type anything yet. You're going to wait until the next step to share questions that you might ask about using art to learn languages. And I put some examples here to help prompt some thinking. Remember, these aren't questions that I want you to answer. These are just questions you might ask about this topic. So, what is a way I can use art to teach writing? What are the similarities between learning how to draw a llama and learning how to speak a language? When do children start telling stories about the pictures they draw? So take a minute more and think about some questions you might ask about using art in order to learn a language. Using wait time with these activities is a really good idea when you're doing them in the classroom, mostly because most learners aren't expecting that wait time. They're expecting things to go right along at a very quick pace. And we're going to be able to keep things a little slowed down here in these last few minutes. So now let's go to the next slide. And now share those questions in the chat. And here's those same questions that I just posed before, but go ahead, put them right into the chat. And we're going to see those questions start to populate. And there's going to be one more step. I said this was like the most complicated one. And this is the complicated one. So we're going to start seeing these questions showing up. And
this is a great activity for language learning in general, too. One of the things I struggle with when learning new languages is how to formulate questions, because oftentimes the grammar is different and the word structure is different for a question rather than a statement. So this could really generate a lot of practice for our students to start asking questions in a different language.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's go to the next step on the next slide. So as you're seeing these other participants' questions, add new questions that are inspired by the questions you already asked. And I put some examples of that as well. So after I ask those first few questions and I see others' questions, I might ask, what forms of art can I use to teach writing? Or how can we simplify vocabulary into its basic parts or shapes? And what if students drew pictures of the stories their classmates told? So these are questions that other questions prompted me to think about.
Okay, now we've got some great questions coming in. Let me share them. So Adriana says, which art forms are the most interesting and stimulating for my students, considering their age, culture, etc.?
Oh, that's a great question. And that might make me think, how might we use older forms of art to engage younger learners in learning language?
And then Edison says, asks, how do you help students to describe a picture thoroughly and infer information from that picture?
That's a great question too. So another question might be, how might we use our knowledge of adjectives to completely describe a picture using only adjectives?
And Patricia asks, how can drawing help you internalize new vocabulary?
Oh, that's a good question. And a really like my first response to that is, how would sculpture help you internalize vocabulary? How would dance help you internalize new vocabulary? I know I'm just filling in the blanks with other types, but I'm doing that because I want to challenge myself to think about other types of art that I don't always immediately think of first. That's a little trick I do for myself when I'm thinking of projects around art, is I try to, after I think of a visual art form, which always comes to me first, I immediately try to think of how dance might work and how music might work.
That's cool. Zafar asks, how can cultural aspects be integrated with art?
Oh, I love that. And that could lead to, how does a culture's art reflect its values?
So I think one of the next steps that we could do just digitally here is you could answer your colleagues' questions with more questions. So Safar asks how cultural aspects can be integrated with art. So you could ask a question to that question, right?
Right? You absolutely could. So the question to that question would be, can you read that one more time? Because I loved it.
How can cultural aspects be integrated with art?
Right. And I might follow that up is, why is art so important to understanding a culture?
Ah,
Right. That might be the way I respond to that with a question.
yeah, there's so many ways that we could apply this.
Right.
And
And then the next slide, we get into some of that, because we
okay,
have
that's good.
more questions, but these are questions that you follow up this activity with. So after the question storm calms down and the sky is clear, we might ask, which of the questions your class brainstorm interests you the most? So imagine all these questions up on a board or written down on a pieces of paper or on a screen, and they just discuss which one of those do they find the most interesting and why. Right? We might organize and sort these questions, which lets us use our application skill. That's the best part of doing a question storm for me, is arranging and sorting them and looking for what we call trends in those questions. What do we see happening with these questions? And then finally, how might the questions we ask show how much we know about the topic? So you might be able to do an analysis. Look at all these questions. What does this show that we know about this current topic that we're learning in our language? What are we seeing as we look at all these questions? Wow, we're using the same vocabulary words over and over and over again, but we're not using any of the ones from this collection of vocabulary we learned. Or everything is in the past tense. How come we don't have anybody using an imperfect tense in our questions?
How about we think about how we might use Question Storm to help learners develop the literacy skills that we're so focused on?
Oh,
You
that's a
can
great
post your
question.
ideas in the chat, and Dan, I'm sure you've got some ideas as well.
Well, I think using a question storm as a way to get things started in a classroom is great. I think it can become the points of conversation. So you could build dialogue out of people discussing these questions, maybe not finding an answer, but just talking about one of them, talking about posing that question to each other, and then having to speak using all their knowledge of English to have a really good conversation around that question. Right? You could also use it in the sorting. You could have them do some analysis and breaking down and sorting them into those buckets, and then brief explanations of why they sorted them the way that they did. And that could be a piece of writing. It's also
Definitely.
great.
We've got some great comments coming through in the chat, which I'm sure in the next week
Oh,
or so
yes.
you'll get back to, right?
Yes, absolutely. So this week I'm going to be on the American English for Educators Facebook group, and I will be answering questions that we didn't get to during this webinar today, and I'll be responding to your feedback and your thoughts and your ideas. And I love doing it. After each one of these webinars, I go on for about a week and participate and respond to people and try to have some continued learning even after this webinar ends. So please fill up the Facebook pages with your ideas and your thoughts.
That was such a great question storm experience, everyone. We hope that everyone can see the power of asking questions to inspire deeper thinking.
So Jackie, I think we have one last campfire question.
I think we do. And this one will probably have to be fairly quick, and then we can keep moving on with it in the chat over the next week. So the question is, how might we grow quick activities into more in-depth learning experiences? So like the binary voting where there was the yes and the no and the agree or disagree, that could be the base or the platform for developing an essay assignment or an argumentative essay or a compare and contrast essay. But what else could we do?
We could turn it into, we could use those binary votings to create a community project where we find out about what really matters to people in our community. And then we could turn that into a letter writing project where we inform people of what is happening in our community based on the polling that we've done. We could take question storming and we could turn those into, like, I always think it'd be interesting to take question storms and create illustrated books out of them, or illustrated little mini comics or little mini collections that could then be shared. So we know about what is it that, you know, what are we all thinking? What are the challenges that we're thinking about right now? And the idea is simply to go from one quick activity that takes 5 to 10 minutes and pushing into those upper levels of blooms to make them a more complex, even more engaging, longer term activity.
Sounds so fun. And I'm excited to see what everyone has to say in the chat. So I guess to summarize what we're able to think and do in our webinar, what did we do?
Well, we examined all the critical creativity and action thinking and practiced all levels of Bloom's taxonomy, right? We practiced our critical creativity skills using the critical creativity and action card deck, and we explored ways to expand these learning experiences using the questions on the critical creativity and action cards.
Such a great session today. I'm so happy that we were able to come together as a worldwide group and look at critical creativity in action. So thank you everyone for attending today. We've had so many wonderful conversations, and your contributions in the chat have made this all possible. So let's continue this conversation on the American English for Facebook Educators page, where Dan will be answering questions and chatting with you all next week. And make sure to check back on this recording and keep asking your questions, and ask your colleagues questions when they respond as well. So as a reminder, this is the second episode in our webinar, or third episode in our webinar series for critical creativity in action. Our next webinar will be on September 12th, and we hope to see all of you there and your colleagues. Also, be sure to visit americanenglish.state.gov and download the Critical Creativity and Actions cards and manual. They're ready to be used in your classrooms today. And if you'd like physical copies of the cards, please reach out to your Relo and request them. It's important to note that many of the ideas found in the Critical Creativity and Action card deck are from Dan's book that he co-wrote with Amy Burvall called Intention: Critical Creativity in the Classroom. Amy was instrumental in leading the worldwide pilots and creating the preliminary design prototypes for critical creativity in action.
And a big thanks to our entire team for helping make this happen today. There's a lot of people behind the scenes who make it possible for us to have these conversations. Be sure to join me on the Facebook group this week, because I will be adding more ideas and sharing more, and hopefully helping you all to incorporate more critical creativity into your classroom experiences.
Thank you, Dan. Our next webinar is going to be on September 12th. So mark your calendars and we hope to see you all there. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or night.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.